for people who weren't able to make it today. So I'm John Pelan. I'm the Vice Chair of Studies in Photography, which was previously known as Scottish Society for the History of Photography. Studies in Photography is dedicated to the research and promotion of photography within historic and contemporary contexts. And it does this through its flagship journal, Studies in Photography, with special edition prints, books, lectures, and exhibitions. If you're not already a member, I would encourage you to have a look at the membership options on our website at studiesinphotography.com. So I'm just going to share my screen just now. As a member, if you will have access to a broad photographic community, receive a regular newsletter, and you will have access to. So I think that's better. Okay, you will have access to our free entry to our talks and exhibitions, get advance notice, and you'll receive 2 copies each year of our journal, the acclaimed Studies in Photography. Also now you can get unlimited access to a digital back catalogue spanning almost 40 years of studies in photography. So if you join, those are some of the benefits. And I think that the latest one, the access to all the digitized copies of studies in photography, you know, is absolutely wonderful thing to have, and I think will be a huge benefit to anyone who's studying photography, practices as a photographer, or just as interested in the history of not just Scottish photography, but photography internationally. So today we're launching a new series of events, The Chain, in which photographers and people working in and connected with the photographic community interview a selected guest for each event. Today's interviewee will be the interviewer for the next event, and so on. And this afternoon, I'm delighted to welcome the first guest in the series, Robin Gillanders. Robin is an Edinburgh-based photographic artist. I'm sure he'll be known to many of you. He taught history at the Royal High School in Edinburgh for 7 years until 1983, and then worked commercially from a studio in Edinburgh. After a period teaching part-time, he began teaching photography full-time at Edinburgh Napier University in 1988 and became reader in 2004. He left in September 2012 and was awarded an honorary fellowship by Edinburgh Napier in October 2014. Robin has exhibited frequently in Scotland and internationally in France, Spain, Poland, Norway, and USA. His work has been in several publications, and he's published 4 solo books with the National Galleries of Scotland, Berlin, David and Charles. Robin works primarily in black and white in film formats from 35mm to 10:8. He still makes silver gelatin prints, smallish formats in his own darkroom, but he also works digitally and in color. So today I'm going to talk to Robin about his approach to photographic portraiture, which he has explored in his book, The Photographic Portrait, and we'll be talking about some examples of Robin's work. So Robin, welcome. I'd like to kick off with a quote from your book by Richard Avedon, who said, "A portrait is a picture of someone who knows they are being photographed." And you know, this implies a relationship between the photographer and the subject. And I wonder if you could ask how you begin to establish that relationship whenever you set out to take a photograph.
Well, thanks. It's a great quote, you know, and it's one I use often. A portrait is a picture of somebody who knows they're being photographed. So that excludes, you know, sitting hundreds of yards away with a long telephoto lens and taking clandestine pictures. The process really begins for me when I identify a subject that I want to photograph. Now, most of the pictures that I think we're going to talk about today, and probably most of the pictures in that book, which is 17 years old now, incidentally, are not commercially based. They're not commissioned portraits. They're portraits of people that I want to photograph, that I feel a motivation, sometimes a very strong motivation to photograph. So the relationship has probably already begun because I know these people anyway. If they're people I don't know, then my process, which is quite a slow process, is to meet them, to have a cup of coffee with them, to try and think about how I'm going to photograph them and develop that relationship. Sometimes that takes much longer. You know, that first meeting takes much longer than actually taking the portrait. So that relationship is very, very important to me. And, sorry? Sorry, I just thought somebody said something.
I think that was just some background noise, Robin.
All right, okay. So that's so that's really how I go about it, I suppose. You know, building this relationship and this element of trust with the person I want to photograph.
Well, I want to start with a photograph. I think, you know, it's probably one of your best known photographs. I know it's been used in various places, but it's this photograph of Finlay. I gather this caused you some anxiety, and he himself did not enjoy the experience. Was that your recollection?
Yes, yes, indeed. Well, I'm glad you've begun with this portrait, actually, because I think it is probably one of my best, and it's an exemplar for how I try and take pictures. You know, pictures that have some meaning, they have some context. Some of my best portraits, in fact, some of the best photographs in general, are ones that you can tell a wee story around. You know, that a good writer can take the portrait or the picture and write a 500-word essay about it. You know, perhaps with some element of poetic prose involved as well. So in this particular picture, I'd known Ian Hamilton Finlay for about a year. And it was the beginning, really, of a long relationship with Ian, doing collaborative works, which culminated, well, didn't culminate, but as part of that, there was an exhibition at the National Galleries of Scotland. So I actually had a long time thinking about how I wanted to photograph Ian. And, the whole process of making portraits for me is one of decision-making and problem-solving. How am I going to photograph this person in order that it has some meaning to me and hopefully to other people as well? So I decided that I wanted Ian in his smallest rowing boat on a small lochen, as a nod to his fascination with the sea, also his fascination or his hobby of making toy boats. And I wanted to, the composition here is very important because I wanted him with plenty of space around him. So the composition isn't just about an aesthetic, it's about adding meaning to the picture. So here he's relatively small in the frame as a metaphor, if you like, for his feelings of isolation. He hadn't left the garden in 25 years, he's agoraphobic. His isolation from the Scottish art establishment at that time, and so on. So, after a year, I managed to pluck up courage to say, Ian, I'd really love to do your portrait. And I managed to persuade him to climb the hill to the lochen, climb into his wee boat and row it into the center of the lochen so that I could make the portrait. So yes, for me, it's a very successful portrait because it did what I wanted it to do in terms of the metaphor. And of course, this is what I've strived to do throughout my practice as a portrait photographer. Hardly ever achieve it, I hardly ever achieve that level of meaning, metaphorical and symbolic meaning that I managed to achieve with this. So with no humility, I can say that it was a very successful portrait for me. But as I say, very seldom did I achieve that in my portraits, but that's what I tried to do each time.
The next two photographs are of another very well-known Scottish poet, Norman McCaig. And I wanted to show two photographs, one quite formal in the positioning of the subject and how he addresses the camera, and another less informal. I think they were taken maybe a year or two apart. And I wonder if we could maybe put them side by side, and you could talk a little bit about your approach to these and why you took the second photograph in particular with the author,
yes,
the poet looking upwards.
Yeah, Yeah, thanks, John. Well, Norman McCaig, one of Scotland's finest, most famous poets. I think he died just a few years after this portrait was taken. He'd been photographed many times, but I really wanted to make his portrait. I'd always loved his poetry. So I went to visit him, bearing a bottle of Pelan, which was his favourite whiskey. And he's a very dry humour, McCaig, you know, and it's slightly cynical, a slightly cynical humour. And I explained that I wanted to set up this picture, and you know, it's lit, so there's a flash head with a softbox on it. So it's a very formal portrait, and he's looking straight into the lens. In other words, he's looking at me, and that's a technique that I usually use with portraiture, and it suggests that there's a relationship between the sitter and the photographer, because he's looking directly at me, and there's that sort of relationship. You know, the original recce, go and meet him, talk to him. I'd never met him before, and then go, having decided what the stage should be for the photograph, and where I would photograph him and how I would photograph him, and then make the portrait, which didn't take that long. And then the one on the right, totally different circumstances, 35mm. Virtually all of my portraits are shot on medium format. This is 35mm, and it was when a friend of mine, David Campbell, went to interview Norman, and he said, would you like to come along and take some photographs at the same time? So there was nothing constructed about this picture at all, unlike the first one. It's purely observational photography, portraiture. And I was quite surprised and delighted that this was one of the pictures I did out of maybe 36, maybe 2 rolls with 35mm. So a lot of images. And this one, to me, in retrospect, almost as if it's a found portrait rather than a constructed portrait, seemed to me to be particularly expressive. He was just, that was a year later, he was in his early 80s by that time, you know.
And for the second photograph, was he aware that you were photographing him?
Yes, I mean, the camera was on a tripod, I think, if I remember rightly. I'm snapping away. It's available light. There's no flashes going off, you know, because that would have been really too intrusive. But yes, he was aware I was taking the picture, but he certainly wasn't posing for this picture. You know, there's no, unlike the first portrait, there's no direct relationship between me and Norman in this portrait. So they're two quite different portraits that have, I think, different functions. But I just, you know, when I saw the contact sheet and made an enlargement, I just loved his expression. I loved his head, you know, back on the chair, sort of thinking expression on his face, and of course that magnificent white hair that's flowing over the backlit from the window. Yeah.
For your medium format work, Robin, can I ask you, you know, do you set everything up, you know, get the lighting right, you know, get the framing right, take one photograph and that's the photograph you're happy with? Or do you take, you know, a whole series of photographs, maybe even several films worth? Well,
with location portraiture, generally it's 2 rolls of film. It might be between 2 and 4 rolls of film, definitely more than 1. And, you know, when it's a formal portrait, like the one on the left, it takes a while for the subject to settle down, to feel less nervous, to feel less self-conscious. It takes me that length of time for me to settle down and you know, start to sort of in some small way enjoy the process. And nearly always, I think there were actually 3 rolls of film shot of Norman with that first picture. So that's 36 exposures. And this picture would be from the last few frames, I would think. And it's nearly always the last few frames. And sometimes you just go through the process of taking pictures, just so that you're constantly taking pictures and the subject relaxes a bit, rather than pose them and, you know, not take a picture, and it becomes much more self-conscious.
Do you find that any anxiety you might have about getting the photograph right, particularly if it's someone who you don't know that well, that anxiety is carried forward into the expression within the photograph, or do you try and make sure they're as relaxed as possible?
I try and, well, yes, I mean, as an interesting question. The portrait is always is a sort of contract between the subject and the photographer. The subject will only allow you to take the picture they want to take. And sometimes it's a battle of will between the photographer and the subject to try and get the sort of expression that you want. Now, there's a bit of psychology comes in here because, you know, if you approach a portrait and you're chatting away and you're laughing and you're smiling and you're cracking jokes and, you know, etc., etc., that generally will mean that there's a much more relaxed expression on the subject's face. If you go in and say nothing and you just give sort of gruff instructions to the sitter to do this, do that, there's hardly any sort of social interaction at all, then you're going to get a completely different reaction from the sitter. It'll be a lot more severe, a lot more serious. So you can apply some psychology to, you know, the way you approach the portrait in order to get the sort of portrait you want. And that's particularly the case with studio portraiture. I think we do have a studio portrait here somewhere. You know, where you've not got a relationship of the subject with his environment or her environment, but it's in a bland studio environment, which can be quite forbidding for the subject. You know, so you're always finding a way to get the subject to react to the camera in the way that you want them to react. So a bit of psychology involved there.
The next two photographs I want to show are of Ginny Atkinson. I think probably perhaps best known for her role as managing director of the Edinburgh International Film Festival for some time.
Yes.
And the poses in these two photographs, they're taken, I think, maybe about 15 or so years apart. Yes. If I'm right, Robin, you can correct me. So the poses on them are quite different. But yes. But there's also something in them that's quite similar. And for me, looking at them, I see, you know, what could be described as clutter, but actually it seem to be objects that are associated with that person. Yes. As part of the framing. You know, so you've got the cushions kind of rather messily on the sofa. And in the right, you have a lot in the foreground. In the background, you know, a picture of Sean Connery peeking out, a pair of shoes on top of a book. You know, so there's a lot there, and I wondered how you manage that technique of clutter not seeming like clutter, but becoming relevant to the subject. Yeah,
well, I do very much like that left-hand portrait of Ginny. Ginny and I were good friends, still are good friends, of course. And at that time, she was, sorry, yes, that one. At that time, she was a theatre administrator. This is 1989. And I wanted to do a picture of Ginny, which made her look like a strong individual, like a strong person. But also there's a decided feminine side to Ginny. I mean, Ginny loves soft furnishings and colour and so on. So the light on Ginny's face in this image is quite strong. You know, it's light coming from a window. There's a strong shadow. She looks like a strong, self-contained person. But there's the paradox with all these feminine fripperies around, particularly these wonderful silver slingback shoes that I've put on the sofa, just in the front there. So she liked big sofas. She liked these colourful things. And, you know, so there's the tension between her facial expression and the lighting on her face and all that stuff that's in the picture as well. And her pose, you know, that lovely, elegant pose of her foot on her shin. And the second image, this was really for the book. The publisher said, well, look, you know, it's all very well having all these black and white pictures, but can you do some color as well? Well, of course, I work in color, or I worked in color commercially. You know, it's very rare to produce black and white images for reproduction in magazines or in advertising and so on. So I did a series of, I did a few set piece constructed color pictures. And, you know, this is entirely appropriate to Ginny. By this time, this is 2003. Ginny was indeed the managing director, the CEO of the Edinburgh International Film Festival. And Ginny's into colour, you know, you go into her flat and the vibrant colours of the walls and the furnishings and so on. And that wonderful frock jacket that she's wearing, which she used to wear to opening events at the film festival. And, you know, that lovely, slightly humorous expression on her face here, warm but quite humorous. The lighting's quite flat, unlike previous picture, in order to just emphasize the vibrancy of the colors. And the colors, the objects have been orchestrated so that you've got the yellows, yellow of the book, the flowers in the foreground, the cushion, and then the blue of the cup, the blue of the pot in the background, and so on. So it's all been very carefully orchestrated. And it's a picture which, at least in part, is about color. You know, color isn't something that I use very often for my own personal portraiture. I still think that with certain exceptions, color can be a terrible distraction to portraits. But in this case, I think it worked fine. There are some photographers, of course, who work in portraiture exclusively in color and, you know, do some wonderful work with it. I find it very difficult, I must say.
Yeah, I'm guessing if Ginny had been wearing say a yellow jacket, for example, the portrait would not have worked at all.
No, I don't think it would have done. Yeah, that's a very good point, John. The jacket echoes whatever these things stuck in the yellow jar are, you know, that magenta. But because she's wearing this magenta jacket surrounded by yellows and oranges, she really stands out from that. But of course, the danger with a lot of portraiture in color is that, you know, you can't see the person for seeing the color, you know, and sometimes the color can just jar, it can be inappropriate. It's another dimension, it's another dimension to the portrait that can be really difficult to organize. Yeah.
So when you're organizing a photograph like this and you're thinking about the colors and the shapes and the positioning of the objects, are you doing that without the subject there? They're sitting elsewhere. Are you positioning them at the same time?
Well, normally I would, I like to do a recce, first of all, and construct as much as possible so that there are no, you know, there are no unhappy surprises, if you like. In this case, I didn't. You know, I know Ginny very well. We're very close friends, and I got her to sit down and I can put these things around her. The picture of Sean, she's a great fan of Sean Connery, so the picture of Sean Connery is there, the only black and white element in it. So it was very much, we were both very relaxed because we knew each other so well. Just sit there, Ginny, and I'll just construct these things around you, you know. Yeah. So yes, you're not just looking at the monochrome composition, you're looking at the color composition as well, which is an additional element which does make it more difficult.
So the next photograph, you know, this is another quite famous photograph. It's a very striking image of the writer William McIlvanney, and I love the framing and the different geometric shapes, the rectangle in the bench of the window, the square of the clock, the oblique circle in the foreground and of the table. You know, it's a really, really fascinating photograph. He himself looks quite fierce, you know, in that photograph. And you know, is that something that just came across, or was that just incidental, or
well,
did he come across as quite a fierce character?
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, John. Thank you very much. So I'd already done a portrait of Willie in Clark's Bar. This is Clark's Bar in Edinburgh, which was used as a book cover. But this wasn't meant for a book cover. This was something that I wanted to do for myself and for an upcoming exhibition that I was having. So I got in touch with Willie and I said, Willie, I'd like to do a portrait. Clark's Bar again, are you up for that? Yes. So I went about 10:30 before the pub opened, and set up a light, flash head with a softbox, composed the picture as carefully as I possibly could. This is the stage, if you like, and composed it really carefully, even down to, if you look to the right of Willie's head, you'll see a sliver of light running vertically. I'd actually positioned the camera in such a way that that sliver of light was just there, you know, an inch to the right, the light, that would have been too broad, an inch to the left, it would have been obscured. So it's a very, very carefully composed picture. So that was the stage. Willie arrived late, unfortunately. The pub was beginning to fill up, people tripping over lighting cables and so on. And he was very ill at ease. You know, you would say, Willie, just sit there, four square, tilt your head slightly to the left. And he wasn't really enjoying the process at all. And of course, by this time, neither was I, because of the, you know, intrusion of people arriving in the pub. So, you know, after I made this picture, I really didn't like it very much at all. I thought, well, it's just too self-consciously composed. You know, it's just, you know, everything is orchestrated here, even down to the stool in the bottom right-hand corner. I pushed that stool into that, to put some tone into that black space, bottom right, you know. But for me, it was just too self-conscious. And Willie's expression is one, you know, as you quite rightly identified, John, he just looks pissed off in it. Now, Willie is absolutely wonderful, or was a wonderful human being. I mean, I've always loved his writing, both his poetry and his novels. And this to me wasn't really Willie at all. So I mean, I did come round to the idea that I did quite like it some years later. But when I did it, I thought it's just too, it just lacks passion, you know, it just lacks any sort of humanity about it. You know, there's the stage, sit there, Willie, you're the performance, and the performance wasn't very good. You know, not his fault, but it's almost certainly my fault.
Yeah, I mean, I think not knowing the background to that, you know, I'm seeing it as a very powerful image. And I think one of the things that really makes it is the fact his head is slightly leaning to the right.
Yes.
I think if his head had been straight, you know, it might not have worked so well, but because his head is leaning to the left, he's kind of a bit slumped in the chair and he's got a fag in his hand.
Yeah.
That's set against the kind of the formality of the framing and the stage that you mentioned.
Yes. Well, I think you're right. There's a section in this old portrait book of mine which deals with body language and heads and so on. And I had this sort of, I went through this experimental process of getting this person to adopt different head positions. And the position that Willie's head is in is empathetic. You know, he's got his head tilted slightly to one side. It's as if he's listening. It's as if, you know, it's a conversation that's going on. And you'll see that there are two glasses sitting on the table. One is my glass, one is Willie's glass. You know, it's as if I've just got up from the table, having had a conversation or in the middle of a conversation with them in the pub and taken his picture, you know. Of course, it wasn't like that at all. It's all totally constructed. But that head tilt is actually quite important. You know, I mean, if, for example, he had his head straight on, as you quite rightly say, John, maybe his head was up. What does that mean? Slightly defensive, maybe a bit arrogant, you know. If his head's down, defenses go. His head to one side, I'm listening, you know. It's an interesting psychological investigation into people's head positions and what they mean or what they suggest and how that adds to the meaning of the portrait, you know.
I'm also struck with the fact you both seem to be drinking pints of water.
Yeah, I know. I don't know why that is. I really can't remember why there are pints of water, Joe.
So the next photograph is someone who isn't, well known, not famous, but it's a retired school teacher, I believe, in Kingussie, who gives a very straightforward, no nonsense stare. I don't think he's trying to say anything. He's just doing what he's told and staring at the camera.
Indeed.
But maybe just a little bit of background to this one, Robin.
Generally speaking, with my personal portraiture, I'm interested in the individual. I'm interested in the individual and what that person means to me, possibly means to other people. I'm not so interested in typologies or documentary portraiture or photojournalism or that sort of thing. But this is an exception, because actually, I don't have a huge amount to say about this, but I took this as part of a major project I undertook in 2006, where I followed in the footsteps of Edwin Muir and made landscapes and interiors and portraits and so on around the Highlands of Scotland. So I did do quite a few what you might term documentary portraits at that time. And this was one of them. Now, this is actually at the Highland Folk Museum in Kingussie. And, it's difficult to ignore a face like that, and I said to this guy who was, he was in the schoolroom in the Highland Folk Museum, and he had been a school teacher himself, and he was just showing people this, I think, early 20th century schoolroom as part of the Highland Folk Museum. And I said, would you sit for a portrait? And I shot on 5:4, actually. The whole project was shot on 5:4. In the end, I didn't use this portrait for the project because there was nothing really very much to say about it. And there still isn't very much to say about it, I'm afraid. I photographed him because he's just got such a great face, with these glasses and the beard and so on. But sometimes it's just an easy option, it's the sort of thing that might win the Taylor Wessing Portrait Award. You photograph people who look like the other, who are different, who are unusual, for one reason or another. And it's the unusual nature of that person that makes it a good portrait, when actually it maybe isn't that great. It's just you're looking at somebody who's different, that's all.
And would that have informed your decision to shoot with the wide apertures, so that the background and the immediate foreground is out of focus, that your focus was on the character of that individual's face, not necessarily on trying to set them within a wider context?
John, I think, and that's great. I think that's absolutely right. It's his face, really. He's sitting at an old school desk, and there's an old school map in the background. But this is shot on 5:4, as I said, with quite a long lens. To sort of, the background is blurred because of the wide aperture required. It wasn't lit; it was just daylight, so it needed quite a wide aperture. But yeah, sure, it's his face and the intensity of his expression that makes it reasonably interesting. But as I said, it wasn't used in the book, and there's not a huge amount to say about it other than what an interesting face he's got.
Okay. Well, the next photograph, taken in the late 80s of the artist Louisa Burnett Hall, I think that the background to this photograph, is really interesting. The lines drawing you towards the subject's face, and the lighting that you've used for an outside photograph where her face is extremely well lit, but it's a very grey day from what I can see. And I wonder just, how difficult was it for you to place a subject in this kind of location and give framing and shape to the photograph?
Well, I've already said that I spent a lot of time thinking, worrying, about how I'm going to photograph people, and sometimes it's not terribly profound. And in this case, this is a young painter, young artist, who painted the East Lothian landscape. So the obvious thing to do, nothing profound about it at all, was to take her into that East Lothian landscape and make a portrait of her. She was a friend of mine at the time. So this is very much you know, there's an interesting clump of trees. The light is coming from behind. And I put her head into this clump of trees, basically. So it's a composition, really. It doesn't say much else other than it's a composition. And I got her to stick her thumbs in her coat pockets so that there's a sort of triangular composition there. And the telegraph pole on the right-hand side is very important. It wasn't actually lit at all. It's the face has been slightly dodged in the dark room, you know, just to lighten it slightly. Very, very dull day. And sometimes these are the best sorts of weather conditions to make portraits. But no, you know, I'm glad you included this one, John. I mean, I still very much like it.
I'm struck with the comments you made about asking Louisa to hook her thumbs into her jacket. When I think about this next image, I'm wondering, you know, sometimes can the positioning of the arms and the hands, you know, can that be really problematic and distracting in terms of whenever you're posing the subject?
Yeah, I mean, arms and hands are a pain in the neck, so to speak. So in this case, this is Dilys Rose, a wonderful writer from 1998. I think this is one of the few commissioned portraits that's actually in the set that you've chosen, John. So yeah, it's at a kitchen table. She's leaning forward on the kitchen table as if, again, we're in conversation. There's a cup on the table, which suggests we're having a cup of tea and having a chat and so on. She's looking straight at me, as many of my portraits do. But she's engaged. She's leaning into the picture, not out of it or to the side. She's interested in what I've got to say for some strange reason. So yes, this was, I'm sure this was a commission. I honestly can't remember what for. One of the things about this portrait, which is a device I use quite often, is you'll see on the right-hand side of her head, she's lit from the window from the left, and on the right-hand side, the shadow side of her face, it's against that white stripe of window in the background. Now, that's almost pure white, that stripe of light. And what that does is to give you a reference white so that you can decide how you want to print the rest of the image, how dark or how light you want to print it. So you've got that reference white there. I think there's a fill-in flash here as well. Looking at the highlights in the eyes, I think there's almost definitely a fill-in flash there too. But that's why the cup's there. That's why she's leaning forward. Thankfully, she's wearing a long-sleeved t-shirt or whatever it is. So you've not got white arms. You've just got the hands to deal with. So yeah, it you know, fairly successful commission for me, I suppose. Not necessarily one of my best portraits, I may say, but very seldom are commissioned portraits very successful for me.
The use of the natural light, Robin, to frame the right side of Dilys's face, you obviously can detect that a filling flash was used. Are there occasions where you might think, well, there's enough good natural light, you know, that I don't need to use artificial light?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the decisions, one of the difficult decisions. Do I light it? Do I use lighting as fill-in for natural light, or do I only use natural light? And it's the sort of decision that sometimes you just have to make at the time you're taking the picture. You know, you go there with all this gear and end up not using any of it sometimes, or using all of it, you know. You taking lights with you, which involves an umbrella or a softbox or whatever, it can be quite intrusive. Sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes the formality of that lighting setup can help with the intensity of the portrait, but sometimes it's just a nuisance and gets in the way. But it's really only, I think it's really only experience that dictates whether you're going to light it or whether you're not going to light it. Yeah, I mean, it's such a difficult decision to make sometimes.
This is obviously a very personal photograph of Marjorie and Roberto. Did you use artificial light in this one?
No, this is a holiday picture, John. I didn't go with any lighting at all. The contrast range was enormous. It's a holiday picture, which it is personal. It's a picture that's about love. It's almost devotional. It's one that I really felt huge motivation to make. And it's part of all the pictures in that book, the portrait book, and ones I've done since. It hovers, it teeters most dangerously towards the sentimental, and the nostalgic, which generally speaking is something to be avoided, because it's the sentimental can just be very one-dimensional, so it's just a lovely, the light on Marjorie's face, on Roberto's bum, just absolutely delightful. So yeah, I mean, it hangs in my study just now. It's up in there on the wall, just to the left there.
It's very beautiful, but I wondered whether you just happened to be sitting there with a camera in your hand and everything just came, you got lucky in the shapes and the light and the positioning, or was it something you'd sat down beforehand and tried to create?
Well, I can't quite remember, John. I would have had the camera on a tripod, that's for sure, and I would have composed it so that the verticals are vertical, and that the end of the bed there, that diagonal stripe of light was in the right position. I've got the top of the window, and I think, if I remember rightly, Marjorie was sitting there. I can't quite remember. I should go and ask Marjorie. And then Roberto came in bollock naked, and I just got him to kiss his mother on the, on the cheek. So very lucky, really, in many ways, very, very lucky to get that picture. And sometimes, when you get a lucky picture that you feel very little responsibility for making, you can look at that picture and say, God, that's good. What a great picture that is, And it's said, with humility. Am I muted? No, sorry. It said, not arrogantly, because it's almost as if you haven't taken the picture. So yeah, I just love this picture, and of course it's one of the things that photography does so well. It's about memories. God, I remember that. That holiday in Italy in 1993. Just amazing.
This next photograph is quite different, and I think this is one of your most recent portraits, I believe, taken this year. Is that right?
No, I think you're just breaking up a wee bit there, John. Can you just repeat that?
Okay. Yeah. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think this is one of your more recent photographs, Robin, taken this year. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah.
I've done very little portraiture, particularly since the pandemic. This was just taken about 3 months ago, I think.
So this is of the writer John Herdman, and
it is.
It's the sort of photograph that, if most people tried to take it, would come out really boring. but there's something about the way he pivots towards the camera on his bench and the angle of the trees in the background,
yes,
which reflect the angle of his leaning. There's the movement in it, I think, that's really, really interesting, and there's also a real sense of friendliness in his face. And I just wondered how you approach this particular photograph, taking somebody on a bench in a park.
Well, to begin with, this was just before John's 80th birthday. And I knew John. We belonged to some sort of old person's debating and drinking society. Thoroughly lovely guy, brilliant writer. And, this is just down from his house. This is in the Meadows, obviously, in Edinburgh. And it was a sunny day. And Marjorie, who I'm the same woman that was in the previous picture, we're married now. She's always fantastic as an assistant, particularly with older men. She's just great with older men, and it allows me to worry about making the picture, and she's chatting to them and so on. And she's actually holding a large shade, but large circular shade, to shade the light from John's face, to put him slightly in shadow, so that I can have the background much lighter. Now, and then, you know, you get him to sit on the bench, and again, a bit like the Dilys Rose portrait, he's leaning forward, he's turning his head to me, he's interested, you know, he's looking me straight in the eye. We're having a conversation. His mouth is slightly open, as if he's either smiling or speaking or something like that. He's very, very alive, you know, he's very, you know, he's just really quite vibrant in some way. But it's the turn of the head and the leaning. Now, you mentioned the trees. Now, sometimes these things are just magical. This isn't the best example of magic in photography, but sometimes when you make the print, you notice, oh, look at that. The trees are leaning to the right. He's leaning to the right. Isn't that just fantastic? And of course, I hadn't noticed that at the time. So it's a wee bonus. You know, sometimes these magical things happen in photography that you hadn't noticed at the time, but that just make the picture even more special than perhaps it was before. It's not, I don't think it's a great portrait, John, but I'm glad you've included it, because it shows that I'm still taking the occasional portrait.
The last two images I want to talk about, both quite different. They're studio photographs and involve three people, but both different approaches. And I wonder, with this, you know, how many attempts would you have had to try and get the positioning of this right, the shape of the arms, the interlinking of the subjects? It seems like quite a complicated photograph. There's a lot of light and shadow, but you know, was this one particularly challenging for you, or did you enjoy it?
I'm so pleased that you've included this. I'm not going to go on about this picture in huge detail because it's quite a long story, but basically these are three Norwegian students of mine back in 2003, and Marjorie and I became very close to these students after the horrifying, tragic, accidental death of another Norwegian student of mine. We're close friends with these three women. These are three absolutely wonderful, wonderful women. And this was taken just, I think, a few weeks or very shortly before they returned to Norway. I'm still in touch with a couple of them, actually. Marjorie and I are still in touch with a couple of them. And we're still in touch with the parents of the boy who tragically died. But it was a fraught time. It was just a terrible, terrible time. But I felt really, really strongly motivated to do a portrait of these three women. And you can tell there's a hierarchy there with the women. You know, there's one woman there who is particularly strong, who's got her arms around the girl in front. The heads are tilted. The girl on the right is looking inwards. The girl in the middle got her head tilted to the girl. So it's very, very carefully orchestrated. And I think I knew pretty well, before I even set up the camera, how I wanted this to look. I wanted them to be close. I wanted them to be intimate. I wanted there to be this almost sort of sculptural, monumental type of composition. I wanted the camera down low, looking up to them, because I had huge respect for these three women. So I had in my mind what I wanted to get out of this. So it was then a question of composing it, just however I could, basically. But I'm so pleased to be able to show this, you know, because, and these are people that nobody knows, you know, this is another very, very personal picture. Hilda, who's the girl in the middle, she now teaches photography in Norway, and she brought a party of students over, some years ago now, but we're still in touch, very much so. Yeah. Anyway, thank you for showing this image, John.
Well, thank you, Robin. So we'll finish just on one last image, which is, I think, quite different from all your other photographs. This image of three artists, Corinne Polwart, Kathleen Jamie, and Hannah Tulicki. You know, what I'm noticing, well, it's color. It's very, you know, very soft, beautiful colors. the subject on the left-hand frame is looking to your left, and then we have the middle one looking straight ahead, and the subject on the right in a very obvious posed position looking into the distance. And apart from the middle one, I think, which is more traditionally you, the other two are quite different. I wondered, you know, what led to the decision to pose the subjects in that manner.
Well, this was actually, I had a retrospective at Stills Gallery in 2018, I think it was, and there was a bit of money for me to do some new work, and I decided that I would dip my toe in colour for personal work. But you can see that the colours are quite muted, and I decided I wanted to do these three women. I chose these three women quite carefully. They're all very environmentally active. Corinne Powart, Kathleen Jamie, Hannah Tulicki, and again, it's not rocket science, it's not terribly profound, but I wanted them to come and bring with them an object that said something about their practice. So Corinne Powart on the left, she brought some bog cotton from the field outside her house in the Borders. Kathleen Jamie brought this wooden bird that sits on her desk at home. And Hannah Tulicki, it's a tuning fork, and she's listening to that tuning fork, you know. So, you know, it's a sort of project you would set your students, really. It's nothing terribly profound, but each of these women brought something to, you know, to add to the portrait, which gives it some further meaning. I built the set, painted the flats and the table and the chair grey. I painted the table a slightly darker shade of grey than the background flats, because they would be closer to the light, so they would be lighter. So there's this monochrome feel to it, but with the subtle colours of what they're wearing, with the exception of Hannah's necklace, of course, which is really quite vibrant. So these are three individual portraits, but at Stills Gallery in the exhibition and here, they're hung together as a triptych, you know.
Well, thank you, Robin. So that was just a small selection from a huge body of work, and you know, we could talk all day. It's fascinating, but I think we've probably got a little bit of time for questions. People want to either maybe put something in the chat box. I think we might be able to. People raise hands. I'm not sure, but perhaps if anyone's got any questions for Robin about any particular photograph, or even a general question. And here I think we've got something in the chat box. Yeah, so from N Hussein to everyone. I think that might have been, but one of the images in particular. Yeah, I think that may have been just a comment about a particular image. I'm not quite sure which one. Okay, do we have any questions?
It's Graham Barnes, my name. Hi, Robin. I'm really just asking this question to fill the gap, because I can see there are no other questions. I was very fortunate for you that you allowed me to make a print of Roger Hutchinson's portrait that you did, because he was an acquaintance of mine. And I was just and it's quite different, or somewhat different, from any of the other pictures that you've made or shown here today. And I was wondering if I could just hold it up like that. It's a very moody picture. There's a lot of darkness in there. It's another portrait sitting at a table, and some compositional stuff in the foreground. Is there anything you'd like to say about that? Also, I could say as well that in that same shoot you did some outdoor photographs of Robin, Roger.
Yeah.
I mean, mixed up with Roger and Robin. So there was and on Facebook you did a sort of popularity thing where you asked people which photograph they preferred, and I think most people preferred the outdoor one. I preferred the indoor one because I think the indoor one is, as I know Roger himself, he's kind of a moody man, I think, and he's looking very quizzical in the photograph, and so that's why I like this particular one. But I think it might be a bit scary for other people, perhaps. So I was wondering, would you like to comment on that?
Well, it's interesting, Graham. You should show that portrait. It's very similar to the portrait of Dilys Rose that I did.
Yeah.
Except there's no fill-in on the shadow side in Roger Hutchinson's portrait. You see that white window behind him, fulfilling more or less the same function as the window in Dilys Rose's portrait. I mean, this is one portrait where I didn't have a chance to do a recce, but I couldn't go and visit him beforehand and think very carefully about how to do it, which is why there are two different versions. There's an outdoor version and an indoor version. Although to be fair, when I do a portrait, I nearly always have a plan B. However carefully constructed and thought about the portrait is, I nearly always have a plan B, which tends to be looser and less self-conscious in terms of its composition. So yeah, I mean, I still quite like both of them. Not really an awful lot else to say about it, but
I think the only comment I would make is I recognise that this and the Dilys one are very similar in style.
yes.
But this is significantly more moody than the Dilys one.
Yes,
that
it
would
is.
be my comment. Yeah.
Yes. No, I would agree with that, Graham.
Well, Robin, I can see we've got two hands up, one from Pradeep Malde and one from Pete Moore. So I think Pradeep got there first. So Pradeep, could you take yourself off mute? There we go. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Thanks so much for this. This is always fascinating, and especially waking up to a talk like this is one of the best ways of waking up, I think. So thank you. I'm in very far away in Tennessee. So, Robin, it's obvious to say that the thing that is common to all portraits made by a photographer is the photographer. You talked about the psychology of making a portrait, but in thinking about all of your work together, would you say something about yourself? There is a special quality about all of your work. I would sum it up in one word: gentleness. If I had to add another word, compassion. How true does that ring to you about yourself? And just maybe expand on that a little bit more. What have you found out about yourself over the years? Thanks.
Thanks, Prad. That's great. From somebody who I've photographed many times, wonderful photographer himself, of course, and a wonderful portrait photographer. Yeah, Prad, I think I've always photographed for love, or at the very least, high regard for somebody. I mean, certainly for my personal work, even in my commissioned work, like book covers I've done, I've been very lucky that it's been people I've, broadly speaking, liked a lot that I've photographed. And, going back to when I was a very young photographer, 18, 19, 20, whatever, you meet somebody, you have a very high regard for them, you maybe even love them, and making a portrait of them is about almost having a piece of them. It's almost like owning them, and you extend that love for the person, that involvement with the person, into the darkroom. Which is one reason why I still photograph mainly in black and white. So, you know, you make the portrait and then you continue that relationship with the person when you're printing the negative in a darkened room. And you really feel that involvement with them. It's almost, you know, I hesitate to say it, but it's almost spiritual, you know. Now, you don't have that feeling at a computer screen or whatever, going into the darkroom, teasing the print through the developer, drying it, you know, all of that, toning it. It makes a really strong emotional involvement with the person you photographed. So I photograph, I mean, my early, very personal stuff, photographing for love, really, whether it's male or female. You know, and love is multifaceted. You know, there's all sorts of different degrees of love. Photographing for dislike or for hate is very one-dimensional, you know. So I always try and photograph for love. I always try and take kind pictures. Now, the picture of, having said that, you know, the picture of Ginny Atkinson, that first black and white picture, she really didn't like that picture to begin with, because it made her look, what did she call it? She said, I look like a slab-faced cow or something. You know, she really didn't like, because it made her look almost too masculine. But I always liked it, because I think it really, it was made, a picture made with love and respect for that person. It's not necessarily the case that you have to flatter somebody in order to make a good picture. But having said that, I would never be unkind in a portrait, far from it. So thank you. I mean, I think the word is empathy. You know, you try and develop an empathy with the people that you're photographing. But thanks, Brad. I appreciate that comment.
Well, thanks for that. And I probably time for one more question, because I mentioned people are now wanting to have their lunch, but maybe not. Brad wants to have his breakfast, but Pete, you had your hand up. Do you still have a question?
Thanks, John. Hi there, Robin.
Hi, Pete.
Yeah, no, I was just going to ask. I mean, you know, I'm sort of into kind of repeats and returns in photography and that kind of stuff. I was interested and really interesting to sort of hear all this. And as you just summarised it in Prad's question, the empathy between yourself and the subject, the narrative, the visual narrative, and also the sort of spoken narrative, in order to you know, to bring the portrait together. But I just wanted to know about obviously some of your stuff is driven by commission. Some of your stuff is driven by sort of your interest in the subject, or your relationship with the subject, you know, before you've got into the photograph. And I just wondered whether that one picture was enough, and whether there was, like with Ginny Atkinson, you returned and you recomposed, completely reconfigured, colorized, you know, the whole kind of thing in a very different way, and whether you'd done that on other subjects as well, or whether one documentary, one photograph, one portrait quite often is that snapshot in time. And
yeah, yes. Thanks for that, Pete. Interesting question. There are several people that I've photographed many times. I mean, you know, the idea that you take the definitive portrait of somebody is just bollocks, of course, you know, because people are multifaceted, people change, there are different aspects to them, but not just aspects to them, but a change in the way that your relationship with that person changes. So it's about them, but it's also about me as a photographer. So, you know, going back to that very first picture of Ian Hamilton Finlay, for example, I think in my book, I said I only photographed him once. I said, I can't improve on that. Anything else is an also ran. Well, in fact, I did do another portrait of him, a serious constructed portrait of him in 2004, some considerable time later. And it was in his porch this time, and there was a bust of Rousseau in the background and so on. So it's a very, very different portrait. But I'm very glad that I did make that second portrait, even although I think the first one, you know, was just full of content as far as I was concerned. But yeah, I think it's very interesting to revisit people and photograph them, you know, again and again throughout their life, you know.
Okay, well, I think probably we'll end it there. And that was a fantastic session, really, really interesting. And I think, certainly I got from your photographs, Robin, what Pride Up had talked about, and you explained wonderfully the empathy and the kindness and the gentleness and the love that comes out, which contrasts with a lot of contemporary photographers who look to shock, or look to surprise. I think there's so much empathy and connection in your photographs. It's wonderful to see. It's just very warm. I'd just like quick thanks to John McDougall, for all his work in setting up this event and the other events. Thanks very much, John. And thanks to everyone who's coming. And, let's all give a virtual round of applause to Robin, for his talk and ongoing work. The next in the series is Robin in conversation with David Williams. That's on the 18th of November, 2021. What other year would it be? But we are hoping to run these events right through into 2022, and if not once a week, certainly a couple every month. And as I said earlier, if you're not already a member, please do consider becoming a member of Shop. We're mostly volunteers. We do have a couple of very part-time members of staff, but we're mostly volunteers, and we do depend heavily on people subscribing to the channel and becoming members. So please do share the news about the organization, about this series of events. So I'll let you all get back to your days now, and thank you very much. Goodbye for now.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Robin. Lovely.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Very much. See you, Brad. Bye-bye.
Bye. Cheers.
Bye-bye.